Hi, my name is Bob Brown and welcome to my 8mm channel. This is the second of a three-part series on how to digitize your 8mm movies. In this segment, we're going to talk about how we can synchronize our soundtrack to our movies. One of the things we need to confront is drift. And by the way, your soundtrack will drift, I promise you. What I mean by drift is it will go eventually, probably quickly, out of synchronization. Well, there's reasons for that. Speaking of sound, let's get that part out of the way first. I'm referring to how to get your sound off of your film. Let's take a look at how to do that. First, you're going to need a sound projector with a 3.5mm headphone port on it. You're also going to need a cable with a 3.5mm connector on one end and a USB connector on the other end. The USB will go into your computer and the 3.5mm connector will go into your projector. And finally, you're going to need an audio recording program. The one I use is Audacity. Audacity is a free, open source audio recording program. That's the one I use. It's awesome. There's no spyware or anything like that. But it doesn't really matter what program you use. That's just the one I use. Here's the thing though. When you do record your sound, make sure you export it as a WAV file. That's .wav. That's a lossless file. In other words, it's equal to the original recording. If you're lucky enough to have a sound film, you're going to have to sync the sound to the correct image. But you're also going to have to deal with one other issue, and that is drift. The initial syncing of the sound is pretty easy. But what happens is your sound starts going out of sync. And there's reasons for that. Let me just quickly explain why that happens. Your soundtrack had to run through multiple devices. First, it started with the camera, then to the projector, and from the projector you sent it to your computer where you converted it into a WAV file. The digitizer really didn't matter because there's no sound, but then you ended up in an editor. Well, the editor is extremely precise. However, the camera and the projector, well, they're not really exact or synced to each other. Yes, they're 18 or 24 frames per second, but they're two separate motors running those devices. This is just an FYI. The recording head on a Super 8 camera was 18 frames ahead of its corresponding image. And by the way, regular 8 film also had sound available, but that soundtrack was 56 frames ahead of its corresponding image, which essentially equals 3 seconds away. So yeah, your sound's going to drift. But don't worry about it, because I'll show you how to fix that in a little bit. It's really not very hard. A little tricky maybe, but not hard. Clearly, you're going to need some sort of editing program. Here's some of them. There's DaVinci Resolve. There's a free version and a studio version. The studio version is $2.99. They're both identical. The only difference is the paid version has some extra filters and features in it. There's Adobe Premiere Pro, which is a subscription-based program. Final Cut Pro, which is $2.99. Vegas Pro, that's $3.99. And there's iMovie, which is free through Apple. It's kind of a scaled down version of an editing program. It works, but not like the other ones I mentioned. There's some preliminary steps I suggest you take prior to editing your movie. I use DaVinci Resolve. You know what? It's free. I suggest you just download it and you can do exactly the same things I do. All right, well, let's get started on it. When you first open DaVinci, you'll see this screen. Double-click on Untitled Project. That will bring you to the editing screen where you'll take these steps. All of these steps are the same no matter what program you use. Of course, I'm using DaVinci Resolve. However, my friend Johnny, he used Vegas Pro. The first thing we're going to do is open our program. Select the icon. Okay, now select Untitled Project, double click, and there's our new project. We're going to drag and drop our files into the media pool. The media pool is where you bring in all of your files for your project. Now, if you don't see this here, see where it says media pool? It's probably not highlighted. See, it's grayed out. Just select it and there it is. Now we're going to drag and drop our movie. This is a movie I've already done. However, the original file is still there. There it is right there. I'm going to drag and drop that in right there. The next thing we want to do is correct the frame rate. And here's what I mean by that. Remember, the digitizer rendered at 20 frames per second. We need to correct that. We need to correct it to 24 frames per second to match the movie. I'm going to right click here on that file. I'm going to go to Clip Attributes. Click on that. And then you can see video frame rate right there. It shows 20 frames per second. In the case of this movie, we already know it's a 24 frame per second movie. So let's change that right now. 24. It's as simple as that. And then select OK. The next thing we're going to do is drag and drop in some additional files. These are called Johnny's 8mm templates. My friend Johnny made these, and he gave them to me because he used the Wolverine first. We split the cost of that thing. Now, select these 3 Photoshop templates. Oh, and by the way, all of these templates you see me use, they're going to be available for you to download if you want. They're called Johnny's 8mm templates.zip. Look in the description below. I also included a PDF which outlines every step that we take along the way. Now, drag and drop those files into your media pool. We're not going to worry about the WAV file just yet because we're going to do that separately. Everything we're doing here is in the Edit page. It's that icon down at the bottom. That's the one you'll select. There are other page icons. I just deactivated the ones I rarely use. The first thing we're going to do is drag in our white background. That's going to be the bottom layer. Just drag that right there. And then the next one will be the movie. That's going to go above that one. Then on top of that one, you'll place the red 1440 grid. And then on top of that one, notice I'm dragging and dropping, by the way. You can also just right click here, add tracks. I want one track above video 3, and I don't want anything in the audio section. Add track. And now we have an extra track on there for the black sidebars. And we'll just drag that right on there, just like we did the other ones. Where am I? There we go. Now, we need to deactivate the black sidebars. So we'll come over to this window. See, it says Disable Video Track. Select that, and now it no longer appears. You can now see the white background. You can see the movie, and you can see the red grid lines. That's our aspect ratio guide. I'm going to move the playhead, which is this upside down triangle with the red line under it. and I'm going to move it to the right so I can see a live frame. The first frames are not exposed. That's why it looks all gray like that. But as I move it to the right, I can see an actual frame. There we go. The next thing we'll do is select the movie. There we go. And you can see the orange border all the way around it. And then you'll come over to the inspector. There it is. And we're going to zoom in on it because remember, these are our guidelines here for the aspect ratio, but they're not written in stone. And you'll see what I mean in a second. So zoom in. I find that it's usually around 1.230 is the best area. You'll see that when I'm done. See, right now it's not there, but we need to make some adjustments first. Notice the distance from this bottom frame and that top frame. They're different. And I want to make them as close as possible. But before I do that, notice there's a space here at the bottom that's larger than the space here on the right side bottom. What I'm going to do is rotate the entire image to make that more level. So it's rotation angle, go to the numbers, click inside of it, and just move your mouse to the right. And there we go. We can just kind of fine tune that in. Okay, that's pretty level. The next thing we'll do is go back to the zoom and notice the lock is now highlighted. You want that highlighted because if you don't, let's unhighlight it. It only moves the Y coordinate, which is up and down. I'm going to hit Control Z to put it back to the way it was. Command Z on a Mac. And then highlight that to lock them together again. And it doesn't matter whether you mess with the X or Y because they're going to move together. And I'm going to start zooming in. Okay, and I want to get it so the frame lines are relatively equal on the top and bottom. Right now they're not, so I'm going to have to move the whole image up. So that's what I'm going to do right now. So as I move it up, there's just a hint of black frame line on the top and bottom. And sometimes these frame lines are not going to be straight no matter what because they can be a little warped, I guess. But so what? You just fix it the best you can. I'm going to continue moving this to the right on the zoom part. And there it is. Again, remember I said it's usually around 1.230. At least it is for me. Now we're going to move the entire image because as you can see, to the left side, there's a lot of good area here. And to the right, there's pretty much nothing between the red line and the black edge. Well, that's where it should be when it's all said and done. But we're going to have to move the whole image to the right first. So go to Position. X is left and right. Go to the X, click inside of there, move your mouse to the right, and watch the image. It's moving now to the right. And I'm just going to try and balance it to where it looks visually the best. And I think that's the spot. There's a couple ways of doing the next part. I think I'm just going to do it the easy way, I guess. Now I clicked on the grid lines, and I'm going to move those grid lines out. So I'm going to move in the inspector and see it. The grid lines are moving now from the zoom. I want to move those pretty much where I want the black bars to end up. Okay, so I still have just a hint of movie here and a hint of movie there. I'm trying to stay away from this sprocket area because it's just garbage in here. Now, we can go to the black bars, the sidebars at this point. But before we do, there's one other thing I want to do with the movie, and this was Johnny's idea. and that is to add in an optical flow. These movies don't always move all that smooth sometimes because they are a million years old after all, give or take a week. So what you do is you go over to Retime Process, select that, and at the very bottom is Optical Flow. This will change how your movie runs in terms of smoothness. It smooths it out really nice and looks way more natural. It looks great, as a matter of fact. Now that that's done, let's go ahead and bring in our sidebars. Turn off the red grid line. Turn off the white background. And now you're going to, whoops, I want that red grid line back on there. Okay. So now I'm going to turn on the black sidebars, and I'm going to go to the Y or the Z on zoom and start moving them out. Okay, and then I want to just make it so it just covers those red lines. That's my frame now. Here's another thing we're going to do to smooth out this edge a little bit because it's pretty sharp. And that is we're going to add a Gaussian blur to that clip. Go to Effects up here at the top and just select it. And there's the Gaussian blur right there. Take that, left click, and drag it right onto the clip. As you can see, there's now an FX, white FX box right there. That means you applied an effect. So go to the effects area in the inspector. Right now it's kind of grayed out. It's not as grayed out as the rest of these things. It just lets you know there's something in there. So once you click on it, it gets nice and bright white. The next thing you'll do is deselect same horizontal and vertical. That's like that same lock icon in the video section. Just click on it because in this case, we want everything to move individually. There's horizontal strength and you have vertical strength. We're going to change the horizontal strength to, you can just type it in, double click inside there and put 0.124, enter. And then we're going to go to the next one, vertical strength. That's 0.250. Now we've softened this edge just enough to where it's not as like a razor blades cutting through the image. As far as this black area is, sometimes you get a movie with a little what's called vignetting. I kind of just ignore it. It doesn't really add or subtract from the movie because if you got rid of that and moved your black bars here, you have way less image. It's not, it's not anything I think is crucial, so just leave it there. I'm not going to do any color corrections with this film because, well, it held up really well. I shot it with Kodachrome, and Kodachrome, for some reason, held up great over time. I'm going to do it with a different film and a different film stock, the Ektachrome, because that didn't fare so well. I'll do a down and dirty version of color correction. But for right now, this is a good film to do sound sync. And I am going to show you how I go about doing that. And we'll work with fixing drift. The first thing I want to do is clean up my interface. I want to get rid of the clips I'm not going to use. Right here we have the red 14x40 grid. We don't need that anymore. So let's go over to video 3. Right click on that section and then it'll say delete track. That's gone. Let's do the same thing with the white background. Go to where it says video 1, right click on that, delete track. Now we have a lot more user interface to work with. Also, what we need to do is change the audio because right now it shows 2.0, which is stereo. However, I know the movie is mono. So let's go over here where it says 2.0, right click there and go to change track type to mono. If you leave it in stereo, the sound will only come out the left speaker. If you put it in mono, it comes out both speakers equally. I want to move the movies up a little bit, so I'm going to grab this bar right here. See how it just changed? Left click there and just slide the whole thing up a little bit. And it kind of puts everything more in the middle. The next thing we're going to do is drop in our WAV file. And there's our WAV file. Left click on that and just drag and drop it into the media pool. From that point, you're going to drag and drop it on the audio 1 track. To save some time, I went ahead and put some markers down so that we could sync the sound a little quicker. But I'll also show you how I utilize those markers to help sync the sound. Now let's sync up the sound. Whenever you do sync up your sound, I find it best to always sync your soundtrack to the movie, not the other way around. Leave your movie alone. I mentioned markers before, and to put down a marker, you just select the letter M on your keyboard. Let's move the playhead over a little bit and I'll show you what I mean. Right now, there's nothing selected here. That means the marker will go at the very top, right at the playhead. So I'm going to select M, and there's the marker right under the playhead. Now, if I select the film strip and type in the letter M, the marker will now go directly on the film strip under the playhead, right there. And then if I select the audio track and type the letter M, it places a marker on that. I then double click on the marker and give it a name. The name I give it is the first word that they're going to say. So let's say they say hello. I type in hello. I do that for all 3 of the markers. So I know those are the points where they all line up and where she says hello. The markers I just showed you are all lined up. However, they're really not in sync. I just wanted to show you how to use the markers. We're going to go over more in depth on how to sync everything up with those markers. I like to match the colors for any particular cue. Then if there's another instance of where I need to line something up, I use a different set of colors. So just double click on that and change the color of the markers so you don't have the same color going along and you don't get confused with which is which. Okay, let me get rid of all 3 of those markers. Control Z, Control Z, Control Z, Control Z, and they're all gone. Now, let's go to the markers, which I've already pre-set up. The first one is this blue one up here. Just click on that thin gray timeline directly under the blue marker. That will put your clip in the vicinity of where that marker is. Let's pretend like those markers really aren't there. To sync the sound on our movie, we're going to use the same principle as a clapboard. A clapboard simply makes a large clap sound when the sticks hit together, and then you turn around and take that visual where they touch and line it up with the soundtrack, which makes that clap sound. We're going to do the same thing, only we're going to do it with dialogue. Hunt for certain words and phrases or whatever they might be to line up our soundtrack. For example, if someone says hello, you can line it up on the O. You take your soundtrack, which you hear O, and you look at their lips and you line up with that shape on their face for an O. So that's kind of what we're going to do. Let me show you how we're going to do that. Start with everything set to 0. When I say that, I'm referring to the movie track, the audio track, and the playhead, and we will work forward from there. If you look at the timeline just under the movie player, you'll see 3 markers. The first one is blue, the second one is orange, and the third one is white. To save time, I went ahead and pre-labeled all of those markers. For example, if you hover over the blue marker, you'll see it displays "I was good." I gave it that title because those are the words my sister said. I wanted to sync the sound and the video and place markers in those positions. That way I can quickly resync it if I accidentally somehow moved a track. Now, in order to get to that spot really quickly, all I have to do is click on that little gray timeline just underneath that blue marker, and everything jumps over to that area. So there's our three markers. You have one on the timeline, you have one on the film, and you have one on the soundtrack. Right now, they're out of sync. Remember, the sound on 8mm movies is 18 frames ahead of the picture. So you will hear the sound before you see it visually on the movie. Let's take a look at that. I'm going to move the playhead this way. Now, my sister said I was good. Now I'm going to double click on the blue video clip marker, and I wrote in there, I was good. All of the markers have the same name and the same color, because that way you know they all go together. I'll select done, and now let's listen to the soundtrack. I'm just going to hit the space bar.
I was good. I was good.
When you hit the space bar a second time, it goes back to where you started. You can clearly see it's out of sync. You can hear the sound before the picture. So what we're going to do now is move the soundtrack to the right, in other words, advance it to catch up with its associated frame. I'm going to turn off the snapping tool. It looks like a magnet. The reason for that is because when the playhead or the markers get near each other, they snap together. I don't want that to happen right now. I want full control without disruption. Now let's advance or move the audio clip to the right. The reason I can nudge or move that soundtrack to the right is because it's one solid track. There's no cuts in it anywhere. If I put a cut in that track further down the road, then what would happen is when I go to nudge it, it's going to go right over the other track. So this is why I always start at the beginning and work my way kind of down the road, if you will. Now I'm going to purposely keep it off a little bit so it stays incorrect. But you can see it's getting closer.
I was good.
It's pretty close. So now the magnet is on, and that marker and the other two will all snap together. The other two are already in line. Now they are all in line because it's snapped. As a matter of fact, the playhead will snap to that too if you want it to. Everything snaps together. So let's move the playhead back again and let's watch the same scene.
I was good. I was good.
That's perfect. That's exactly what I wanted. Now I'm going to move the movie again all the way to the beginning, and I want you to see something. As you can see, there's now a gap at the front end. But in reality, nothing is happening there. So that gap means nothing because you're going to edit that out anyway. So we can do that right now. Back it up a little bit. Right there. And then I'm going to highlight that clip. I'm going to highlight the movie clip. And then I'm going to select Control B. Now that we've trimmed those two clips, all we have to do is now select the delete key, and that will delete those two little sections and close all the gaps along the timeline. Now be careful when you select that delete key, because all of your clips will shift to the left together and they'll fill that gap. But you may not want that to happen. You may just want to leave that gap there. If that's the case, then select the backspace key. That will remove those clips and leave the space there. Now let's go to the next one. If you notice, we're using the exact same principle as that clapboard. we're going to use a visual with an audible cue. Now we're going to go to the orange marker, which is my second one. And again, I already set this up to save time. And I'm going to click on that little gray timeline under the orange marker, and it pops us right where we want to be. There's the orange marker on the timeline, there's the orange marker on the movie, and there's my orange marker on the soundtrack, and that's going to line up with the other two. But again, just to save time, I pre-cut the audio clip right there. I'll show you why I cut it there in a second. So let's look at it now. If I highlight the orange marker here, you can see it says first, let me double click that. First, okay, Bob. That's where my sister says, okay, Bob. And if you notice also, there's these markers under here. That orange one right there, you just click on that color to change the marker color. I'm going to select done. And then I named this one the same thing. Done. Let's listen to the soundtrack. I'm going to run it back a little bit, and then I'll select the space bar.
Okay, Bob. Okay.
You can see right away it's completely out of sync. She says, okay, Bob, but you hear that before you see it on her lips.
Okay, Bob. Okay.
So I'm going to now move the playhead forward. Every time you select the space bar, it starts the playhead. If you hit it again, it goes back to where you started. So now, let's move that soundtrack to the right, or advance it, if you will. But first, I want to take off the snapping tool, because the playhead and the markers will all snap to each other. I don't want that to happen right now. So I'm going to select the letter N as in November, and that turns off the magnet. Now I'm going to nudge this forward or advance it, the soundtrack. I'm going to leave it a little bit off. The reason I cut it here is because there's nothing really happening there. There's nothing but dead space there. So let's go to this one now, and now I'm going to test the sound again.
Okay, Bob. Okay.
That's pretty close, real close. So let me turn on the snapping tool. I'll select N. Really, it's the magnet. And I'm going to nudge it a little bit further to the right where I know it's right. And it snapped to this one. As you're doing it, they're not going to snap because you're not going to have markers there. You're finding the place where you want the markers. Once you get everything in place, then lay down your markers. So if anything happens later on in the movie, you can always go back and line those up again. So let's listen to it one more time and watch it. Let me make this screen a little bigger. There we go. So I'm going to go hit the space bar.
Okay, Bob. Okay.
Okay, that's perfect. Now we have a gap over here. We need to fill that gap. So I'm going to come over to that soundtrack and look at that particular icon. When you see it look like that, that means you can close up the track without moving the whole thing. So here's what I'm talking about. I'm going to close the gap because when you cut your track, it never really goes away. It's still under there. Now, let me show you how to fill that gap. You can't just move the whole track, but because look what happens. I'm going to highlight it and move the track, but I don't want the whole track to move. I just want to close that gap. Let me hit Control Z. put it back to where it was. So now, and then let go, and there you have it. And the reason that works is because you're dealing with the same ambient sound in that room and nothing's happening. So you hear the same thing throughout that whole section. So that worked great. So now,
Okay, Bob.
let's put this back to where it was supposed to be and close this up again. And now let's hear it and see it.
Okay, Bob. Okay.
Okay, perfect. Something else you might want to consider is using filters to help clean up your sound or improve it anyway. That's out of the scope of this video, but you may want to look into that. So in this video, we essentially covered how to grab the soundtrack from your movie and convert it to a WAV file. We also learned to synchronize the sound to your movie, and we dealt with drift, which is a problem. But we solved that problem. Anyway, in part 3, I'm going to do a down and dirty version of editing in terms of color correction and sharpening. Well, I'll throw in a few other tidbits as well, but anyway, that's pretty much what's going to be in part 3, the final version of this 3-part series. Anyway, I hope you got something out of this, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.